The tears came without warning. Katha Schmidt stood in the back of the army truck, her fingers gripping the wooden slat so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Through the dust clouds kicked up by the wheels, she watched the ranch disappear behind her, the windmill that had creaked every morning, the barn where she'd learned to saddle a horse, the long wooden fence she'd helped mend 100 times, and standing there in the Texas sun, hat in hand, the cowboy who'd taught her that Americans weren't monsters. She tried to speak, to say thank you, to say anything, but the words caught in her throat and became sobs. Around her, other women wept too, not tears of relief at going home, but tears of grief at leaving a place that had been their prison, a place that had saved their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. But that moment of departure was still months away. To understand why these German women cried at goodbye, we must return to the beginning, to the fear, to the moment when Katha first stepped onto Texas soil and believed with absolute certainty that she was about to die. It was late autumn, 1944. The transport truck rattled through the dust outside Amarillo, its engine coughing and sputtering in the dry heat. Inside sat 23 German women, their field gray uniforms stained and wrinkled from weeks of travel. They had crossed an ocean in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship, then been loaded onto trains that carried them through landscapes so vast they seemed impossible. Through the slats of the cattle cars, they'd watched America roll past. Endless farmland. Cities untouched by bombs. Children playing in yards. It was a country at war, yet it looked like paradise compared to the Europe they'd left behind. Katha Schmidt was 24 years old. Back home in Hamburg, she'd worked as a radio operator for the Luftwaffe, monitoring Allied communications from a concrete bunker outside the city. She'd been captured near Cherbourg in the chaos following the Allied invasion, rounded up with dozens of other auxiliary personnel when German lines collapsed. For weeks after capture, she and the others had waited in makeshift holding camps in France, certain that execution orders would come. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were savages, a nation of criminals and degenerates who valued nothing but money and machines. Captured Germans, especially women, would be beaten, starved, perhaps worse. The Reich's radio broadcasts had repeated these warnings endlessly. Every German soldier and auxiliary knew what to expect. But the execution never came. Instead came processing paperwork, medical examinations, delousing stations, and then the long journey west. Still, the fear never left. Katha had watched other women whisper prayers at night, convinced each new transport brought them closer to their end. When they'd boarded the ship for America, one woman had tried to throw herself overboard. Guards had pulled her back, not roughly, but with the kind of firm gentleness you'd use with someone in shock. That had confused them almost as much as the food. The food. Even on the ship, crammed into holds with hundreds of other prisoners, they'd been fed better than they had eaten in months. Bread that wasn't mixed with sawdust, soup with actual vegetables floating in it, coffee, real coffee, not the bitter acorn substitute they'd grown accustomed to in Germany. At first, many refused to eat, certain it was poisoned, but hunger defeated suspicion. Within days, they were eating everything placed before them, their bodies responding to real nutrition after years of rationing. Now, as the truck rolled to a stop outside the prisoner of war camp, Katha braced herself. This was it. The moment the pretense would end, and the real punishment would begin. The doors swung open, flooding the dim interior with bright Texas sunlight. She squinted against the glare and saw a figure approaching, a tall man in dusty boots and a wide-brimmed hat, not a uniform, not a soldier. He looked like something from the American Western films she'd seen before the war. A cowboy. He reached up and offered his hand to help the first woman down. His voice was slow, almost lazy in its rhythm. "Ma'am, watch your step now. Ground's a bit uneven here." The interpreter translated, stumbling over the casual politeness. "Ma'am, not prisoner, not German. Ma'am." The woman hesitated, then took his hand. He helped her down with the same courtesy he might show his own mother. Then he turned and did the same for the next woman, and the next. When Katha's turn came, she stepped down on trembling legs. The cowboy handed her a tin cup. "You look parched," he said through the interpreter. "Drink up. Plenty more where that came from." The cup was filled with cold, clean water, cleaner than anything she'd tasted since France. She drank it in 3 desperate gulps, waiting for the bitterness of poison, but there was nothing. Just water. Just kindness that made no sense. Behind the cowboy stretched the camp. Yes, there were fences topped with wire. Yes, there were guard towers. But beyond the wire lay something that took her breath away. The Texas sky, so blue and endless it seemed to swallow the earth. In the distance, cattle moved across pastures that stretched to the horizon. Windmills turned slowly in the breeze. Somewhere, a dog barked. The air smelled of hay and dust and something else she couldn't name. Freedom, perhaps, or at least the memory of it. The women were led to their barracks, simple wooden structures with rows of bunks, clean mattresses, blankets, a small stove in the corner for heating, windows with actual glass. One woman touched the mattress and began to cry. "It's real," she whispered, "not straw. Real." They'd expected to sleep on concrete floors or in mud. This was accommodation better than what many had known even before the war. But it was the first meal at the camp that truly shattered their understanding of captivity. They filed into the mess hall, still moving with the mechanical obedience of people expecting punishment. What they saw on the serving line stopped them cold. Roast beef, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans, fresh bread, a slice of apple pie, coffee with real sugar. The portions were enormous, more food than Kata had seen on a single plate in 2 years. They sat at long wooden tables staring at their meals. "It's a trick," someone whispered. "They fatten us before the slaughter." Another woman shook her head. "Or it's a test to see if we take more than we deserve." But an American guard walking past overheard and laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine amusement. "Ladies, you're going to need your strength for the work tomorrow. Eat up. That's an order if you need one." The work. They didn't yet know what that meant. Ranch work, cattle and horses and fence lines, stretching across impossible distances. They didn't yet know they'd be trusted with animals and tools and a kind of freedom that defied every definition of imprisonment they'd known. That revelation would come with the sunrise. That first night, Kata lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling. Around her, other women whispered in the darkness, "Where are the chains? Why haven't they beaten us? What are they waiting for?" Sleep came hard, interrupted by the sounds of crying and prayer. Every footstep outside the barracks sent waves of tension through the room. Every creak of wood sounded like approaching danger. But no danger came. Instead came the steady rhythm of crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind pushing through the mesquite trees, sounds of peace in a world at war. As exhaustion finally pulled Kata toward sleep, a thought occurred to her that she immediately tried to suppress because it felt like betrayal. What if everything they'd been told was a lie? What if the real monsters weren't the Americans, but the people who'd sent young women to die for a Reich that existed only in propaganda? She fell asleep before she could finish the thought, but it would return. Again and again in the coming months, as the walls of propaganda crumbled under the weight of daily kindness. Morning arrived with a blast of Texas heat. The women were roused early, not by shouting guards, but by a quiet knock and a voice calling, "Breakfast in 30 minutes, ladies." They dressed quickly, still uncertain, still waiting for the trap to spring. In the mess hall, they found more abundance. Scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits with jam. The portions were the same as the night before. Not a test, not a trick, just the standard prisoner ration, which happened to exceed what German civilians were receiving back home. After breakfast came the assignment briefing. Through interpreters, an American officer explained that the women would be working on nearby ranches. They would help with livestock, mending fences, cleaning barns, and other agricultural duties. The war had drained Texas of young men, leaving ranchers desperate for labor. German prisoners would fill that gap. They would be paid small amounts in canteen credit. They would write letters home, attend religious services if they wished, and be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. One woman raised her hand, trembling. "What happens if we refuse to work?" The officer looked at her with something like confusion. "Then you stay in camp, I suppose, but you'd miss out on the fresh air and the horses. Most folks here seem to prefer being useful." Horses. They were going to be allowed to ride horses. The absurdity of it was too much. Several women laughed, not from joy but from the sheer impossibility of their situation. The trucks came in the afternoon. Real cowboys this time, several of them, leaning against pickup trucks and chatting with guards like old friends. They looked the women over, not with cruelty or hunger, but with the practical assessment of men judging workers. "They look sturdy enough," one said. "Lord knows we need the help. Can't run a ranch with just me and Pop anymore." Kata was assigned to a group of 8 women heading to the Callahan Ranch, about 20 miles from the main camp. As the truck bounced down dirt roads, she watched the landscape transform. The fences seemed to go on forever. Cattle dotted the fields by the hundreds. A windmill turned lazily against the sky. And there, rising from the dust like something from a dream, stood a ranch house with a porch and rocking chairs and laundry hanging on a line. It looked like home. Not her home, but someone's home. Real. Lived in. Loved. Frank Callahan met them at the gate. He was older, maybe 50, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Welcome to the Callahan Ranch," he said, and waited while the interpreter translated. "You'll be helping us with chores. It's hard work, won't lie to you, but we'll treat you fair. Work hard and you'll eat good. That's the deal." He showed them the bunkhouse where they'd sleep, simple but clean. Then the barn, where horses nickered softly in their stalls. Then the chicken coop, the tool shed, the garden. He explained each task patiently, demonstrating how to carry feed buckets, how to latch gates properly, how to approach a nervous horse. The women nodded, still too shocked to speak much. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and gold across the endless Texas horizon, they sat on the bunkhouse steps. Someone had brought them cold lemonade. Lemonade. In a prison camp. Kata sipped hers slowly, trying to reconcile this reality with everything she'd known. "Maybe," she said quietly, "maybe America is winning because they don't need to be cruel to prove they're strong." The other women looked at her. One, a former nurse named Greta, nodded slowly. "Or maybe we've been fighting for the wrong side all along." No one answered. The words hung in the cooling air, too. Dangerous to acknowledge, too true to dismiss. Somewhere in the distance, a cowboy was singing. The melody drifted across the fields, mixing with the evening birdsong. And for the first time since her capture, Katha Schmidt felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not yet, but the absence of fear. And in a world consumed by war, that absence felt like grace itself. The grace didn't last through the night. Kata woke before dawn to the sound of a rooster crowing, her body still tense with the expectation of violence. Around her in the bunkhouse, other women stirred, whispering nervously. Today they would begin work. Today, surely the real nature of their captivity would reveal itself. They dressed quickly in the work clothes provided, sturdy denim pants and cotton shirts that felt strange after years in military uniforms. When they stepped outside, the Texas sky was just beginning to lighten, streaked with pink and gold. Frank Callahan was already up, leaning against the corral fence with a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. "Morning, ladies," he called out. "Hope you're ready to learn some ranching. We'll start with the horses." Horses? The word sent a ripple of disbelief through the group. They were prisoners of war, enemies of the state, and they were about to be taught to ride horses. The absurdity was so complete that Greta actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound that made the others jump. The corral held 6 horses, already saddled and waiting. They were beautiful animals, well-fed and calm, their coats gleaming in the early light. Frank walked up to the nearest one and patted its neck with easy affection. "This here's Daisy," he said. "Gentle as they come. She'll take care of you if you take care of her." He demonstrated how to approach a horse, how to check the saddle cinch, how to put a foot in the stirrup and swing up. It looked effortless when he did it. When Kata tried, she nearly fell backwards, saved only by Frank's quick hand steadying her. "Easy now," he said, not unkindly. "It takes practice. Let's try again." By the 3rd attempt, she was in the saddle, gripping the horn with white knuckles while Daisy stood perfectly still, as if understanding that her rider was terrified. Around the corral, similar scenes played out. Women who had survived bombings and invasions now struggled with the simple mechanics of staying on a horse. One woman, Anna, got tangled in the reins and yelped in German. Her horse simply turned its head and looked at her with what seemed like patience. A younger ranch hand named Tom couldn't help but grin. "They ain't gonna bite," he called out. "Well, maybe a little if you pull their ears, but Daisy, they're sweet as sugar." The interpreter translated, and despite their fear, several women smiled. It was hard to maintain terror in the face of such casual good humor. By mid-morning, they were walking their horses around the corral, then trotting, then learning to guide them with gentle pressure from their legs and reins. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Keta felt the power of the animal beneath her, the way Daisy responded to her commands, and something shifted inside her chest. For months she'd been powerless, swept along by forces beyond her control, capture, transport, uncertainty. But here, on this horse, she had control again. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The real work began after lunch. Frank led them out to a section of fence that needed mending, the posts leaning and wire sagging. He showed them how to dig new post holes, how to set the posts straight, how to string barbed wire tight without cutting themselves. It was backbreaking labor under the relentless sun. Kata's hands blistered within an hour, sweat soaked through her shirt, her back screamed with every shovel thrust, but Frank worked alongside them, not supervising from a distance, but digging and lifting and sweating just as hard. When they paused for water breaks, he sat with them in the shade, sharing stories about the ranch, about cattle drives, about the year a tornado touched down and they'd lost half the herd. "Ranching ain't easy," he said, wiping his brow with a bandana, "but it's honest. You work, the land provides. Simple as that." Kata thought about the propaganda, about how Germans were taught that Americans were soft, that they'd grown weak from luxury and ease. But there was nothing soft about Frank Callahan. His hands were calloused as old leather. His face was creased from decades under the sun. This was a man who understood hard work in a way that transcended nationality. By evening, when they returned to the bunkhouse, every woman was exhausted. They collapsed onto their bunks, groaning, comparing blisters and sunburns. But that night at dinner, something had changed. They ate with real appetite, not the nervous picking of the previous night. They had earned this meal. Their bodies demanded it. And when Frank came by to check on them, asking if they needed anything, Kata surprised herself by answering in her broken English. "We are good, thank you." He smiled and tipped his hat. "You all did fine work today, real fine." The days began to blur into a rhythm. Wake before dawn. Morning chores, feeding chickens, milking cows, mucking out stalls. Breakfast that could feed an army. Then the real work. Fence mending, hay baling, cattle herding. Every task taught them something new about this strange American world. The machinery shocked them most. Tractors that could plow a field in hours. Trucks that hauled loads that would have required a dozen horses in Germany. Everything was bigger, faster, more efficient than what they'd known. But it was the cultural differences that proved most disorienting. In Germany, they'd been raised in a system of rigid hierarchy. You obeyed orders. You never questioned authority. You knew your place and stayed in it. Ranch life operated on entirely different principles. Frank might be the boss, but he'd ask rather than order. "Think we should move the cattle to the south pasture today?" he'd say, as if their opinion mattered. When they made mistakes, and they made many, he'd simply show them the right way without anger or humiliation. "That's all right, darlin'," he'd tell Anna after she left a gate unlatched and let 3 steers wander. "We all done that once. Here's the trick to remember." The cowboys taught them English the way children learn, through constant repetition and immediate use. "Saddle," Frank would say, pointing. "Saddle," they'd repeat. "Lasso, branding iron, stirrup, bit." The words felt strange in their mouths, but they stuck. Within weeks, they could understand basic commands. Within months, they were joking in broken English, their accents thick, but their meaning clear. Meals became a sacred time. The ranch hands would gather around the long table, and the German women would join them, no longer segregated, no longer treated as other. They'd pass bowls of beans and platters of cornbread and talk about the day's work. Tom taught them to say, "y'all," and laughed when Greta tried it out, the word sounding impossibly foreign in her Hamburg accent. Frank's wife, Martha, showed them how to make biscuits from scratch, measuring flour with her hands rather than scales. Cooking ain't about being exact, she explained through gestures and simple words. It's about feel. One evening in late December, 1944, they sat around a fire outside the bunkhouse. The temperature had dropped, unusual for Texas, and someone had brought blankets. Tom pulled out a harmonica and began to play. The melody was unfamiliar to the German women, something slow and mournful. Then Frank began to sing, his voice rough but sincere. It was a cowboy song, something about lonesome trails and distant homes. When he finished, silence hung in the air for a long moment. Then Kata, surprising herself, began to sing. A German folk song her mother had taught her about forests and rivers and the changing seasons. Her voice wavered at first but grew stronger. The other women joined in, their voices blending in harmony they'd learned as children. The cowboys didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling. Longing, memory, the ache of distance. When the song ended, Martha had tears in her eyes. "Beautiful," she whispered, "just beautiful." And in that moment, the walls came down completely. They were no longer captors and captives. They were simply people, sharing music under the stars, bound together by the universal languages of work and song. But even as bonds formed, the women couldn't escape the mathematics of their situation. The numbers haunted them, making sleep difficult, even when their bodies screamed for rest. Keta began keeping a mental ledger, calculating the impossible arithmetic of American abundance against German scarcity. The food obsessed them. 3,200 calories per day, the standard prisoner ration. Back home, German civilians were surviving on perhaps 1,200 calories, often less. Here, breakfast alone sometimes exceeded an entire day's ration in Hamburg. Beef appeared on the table multiple times per week. Real beef, not horse meat or mystery sausage. They had butter. They had sugar in their coffee. They had fresh vegetables even in winter, shipped from somewhere warm, grown in quantities that seemed impossible. Greta, who'd worked as a clerk before the war, started doing calculations on scraps of paper. "A single cow," she said one night, "can feed how many people? And Frank says he has over 2,000 head on this ranch alone. 2,000. In my entire village back home, we might have had 50 cows total." The implications were staggering. If one ranch in Texas had more cattle than entire German villages, what did that say about the industrial capacity of America, about the impossibility of Germany winning this war? The machinery told its own story. The tractors fascinated Anna, who'd grown up on a farm in Bavaria. "My father used horses," she explained. 2 horses, and we thought we were modern. This tractor does the work of 20 horses, maybe more, and they use it casually, like it's nothing special. She'd seen 3 tractors just on the Callahan ranch. 3. The fuel alone to run them would have been a fortune in Germany. Here, it was measured in gallons per day, an afterthought. The waste shocked them most. Food that didn't get eaten went to the pigs. Perfectly good equipment was replaced because newer models were more efficient. Tom threw away a rope because it was fraying, even though it could have been spliced and used for months more. When Katha retrieved it from the trash, planning to repair it, Tom just laughed. "Darlin', it ain't worth the time. New rope costs next to nothing." Next to nothing. In Germany, rope was precious. Everything was precious. Here, abundance was so complete that waste was acceptable. They began writing letters home, carefully censored before mailing. Katha tried to describe what she was seeing, knowing even as she wrote that no one would believe her. "Dear Mother," she wrote in careful script, "I'm working on a cattle ranch in Texas. They treat us well. The food is plentiful. I've learned to ride a horse. The sky here is so big it makes me feel small, but in a good way, like I'm part of something larger than myself." She paused, chewing her pencil. How could she explain that her captors fed her better than her own government had, that she slept soundly for the first time in years, that she was beginning to suspect everything the Reich had taught her was a lie? She settled for, "I am safe, and I am learning much. I think of you always and pray you are well. I will come home when this is over, but I will not be the same person who left. America is not what we were told." The censor would probably strike that last line, but she had to try. Responses came slowly, taking months to arrive. When Kata finally received a letter from her mother, the words made her weep. "My dear child, you must be mistaken. How can the Americans treat you well? The radio tells us prisoners are starving, beaten, forced into labor camps. Perhaps you are required to write these lies. Send us a signal, some code word, so we know you are truly suffering as we fear." The disconnect was so complete, so total, that Kata didn't know how to bridge it. Her mother was starving in Hamburg, surviving on turnip soup and hope, while Kata was eating roast beef in Texas. The wrongness of it settled in her stomach like a stone. But the work continued, and with it, the slow transformation. By spring of 1945, the German women on the Callahan Ranch moved with the easy confidence of experienced hands. They could saddle a horse in minutes. They could mend a fence line that would hold through any storm. They could read the weather in the clouds and the mood of cattle by the way they bunched or scattered. Frank began trusting them with more complex tasks, helping with calving season, assisting with the branding, even riding out alone to check distant fence lines. "You know what amazes me?" Tom said one afternoon, watching Anna expertly rope a calf that had wandered from its mother. 6 months ago, you couldn't tell a steer from a bull. Now you work like you were born to it." Anna smiled, pleased despite herself. "Good teacher," she said in her improving English, "and good reason to learn. Better than sitting behind wire doing nothing." That was the secret, Kata realized. The Americans had turned imprisonment into purpose. Instead of breaking their spirits through deprivation, they'd rebuilt those spirits through useful work. Instead of emphasizing their status as enemies, they'd emphasized their value as workers. It was a kind of psychological warfare, more effective than any torture could have been. Because now, when Kata thought about Germany, about the Reich that had sent her to war, she felt not loyalty, but something closer to betrayal. They had lied to her. About America. About the war. About what mattered. The quiet confidence of the cowboys had taught her more about real strength than all the propaganda films and rallies she'd attended. Frank didn't need to shout to be obeyed. He didn't need to threaten to be respected. He led by example, by fairness, by the simple dignity of treating others as he wished to be treated. It was a leadership style so foreign to everything she'd known that it had taken months to even recognize it for what it was. As spring turned to early summer, news from Europe grew darker for Germany and brighter for the Allies. Cities were falling. The Reich was collapsing. The women listened to radio broadcasts and read week-old newspapers, watching their homeland disintegrate from across an ocean. They should have felt grief, but instead felt a numbing resignation. The war was ending. Soon they would have to go home, home to rubble and starvation and the ashes of a dream that had consumed Europe. But here on the ranch, life continued its steady rhythm. Fences still needed mending, cattle still needed tending, and every day the Texas sun rose over endless horizons, reminding them that the world was bigger than war, bigger than nations, bigger than the hate that men constructed in the name of flags and ideologies. The endless horizons and steady work had created something the women hadn't expected. Room for humanity to grow in soil, fertilized by routine and shared purpose. It was Tom who first broke through the invisible barrier that still separated prisoner from captor, turning co-worker into friend. He'd been watching Anna struggle with a lasso for 3 days straight, her throws either too weak or too wild, the rope tangling around her own legs more often than catching any fence post. On the 4th day, he walked over with that easy cowboy gait and said, "Mind if I show you something?" Anna tensed, expecting criticism. Instead, Tom stood beside her and picked up another rope. "It ain't about strength," he explained slowly, knowing her English was still rough. "It's about rhythm, like dancing. Watch." He demonstrated the motion, his arm moving in a fluid circle, the loop opening like a flower before settling perfectly over a post 20 feet away. "Now you try, but feel it. Don't think so hard." Anna tried again. The loop wobbled but flew straighter. "Better," Tom encouraged. "Again." They spent an hour like that, him adjusting her grip, correcting her stance, celebrating each small improvement. When she finally landed a clean throw, she let out a whoop of joy that made the other women look up from their tasks. Tom grinned and extended his hand for a shake. "There you go, partner. Knew you had it in you. Partner, not prisoner, not German, partner." Anna shook his hand, and something shifted in her chest. This young man, barely 22 years old, had a brother fighting somewhere in Europe. He'd told them about it one night, how his older brother Jim had landed at Normandy and written home about the Germans they'd captured, exhausted boys who looked half-starved. "Made me think," Tom had said, "about how most folks don't want to be at war. They just get caught up in it." Now, here he was, teaching the enemy to rope cattle, treating her with the same patience he'd show anyone learning a new skill. The connections multiplied in small, unremarkable ways that accumulated into something profound. Greta, who'd been a seamstress before the war, noticed that Martha's favorite dress had a torn hem. Without being asked, she stayed up one evening and repaired it, her stitches small and precise. When Martha saw it the next morning, she pulled Greta into a hug that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, then invited her into the ranch house kitchen. "If you can sew like that," Martha said, "maybe you can help me with a quilt I've been meaning to finish." They spent evenings together after that, Greta and Martha, sitting on the porch with fabric squares and thread, talking in a mixture of English and German and hand gestures. Martha showed her pictures of her two sons, both overseas, one in the Pacific, one in Europe. Her voice cracked when she talked about them, about the letters that came less and less frequently, about the fear that lived in her chest like a stone. Greta showed Martha the photo she carried of her younger brother who'd been killed at Stalingrad. Neither needed translation for grief. It spoke a universal language. "Why do men do this?" Martha asked one evening, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Start these wars that break mothers' hearts?" Greta had no answer. She'd asked herself the same question 1,000 times. Finally, she said in careful English, "I think they forget. Forget we all bleed same color." Martha nodded, wiping her eyes. "Ain't that the truth?" The guards at the main camp proved equally human. There was Sergeant Miller, a gruff man of 40 with a limp from the First World War. He'd been assigned to escort work details, and at first had maintained a stern distance. But he had a weakness for cigarettes and conversation, and the German women quickly learned that if you asked him about baseball, he'd talk for an hour. He showed them pictures of his daughter, who was learning to play piano. Kata, who'd studied piano as a girl, asked questions that clearly delighted him. Before long, he was bringing sheet music from town, and on Sundays, if there was a piano available at the community center, Kata would play while other prisoners and guards gathered to listen. "You play real pretty," Sergeant Miller told her once. "Reminds me there's still beauty in the world, even with all this ugliness going on." He paused, then added quietly, "My daughter's about your age. I hope, if she were ever in trouble somewhere, that someone would treat her decent. So I figure I should do the same for you girls." The collapse of propaganda happened differently for each woman. But for Kata, the moment came during a thunderstorm in April of 1945. The sky had been threatening all day, clouds building into towering thunderheads that turned the air electric. By late afternoon, the first drops fell, and within minutes, it was a deluge. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged white lines, thunder shook the ground, and in the south pasture, 200 head of cattle panicked. Frank came running from the barn, shouting orders. "They're going to scatter! We need everyone!" There was no time to consider that the everyone included German prisoners of war. Tom and the other ranch hands were already saddling horses, and Frank thrust reins into Katha's hands. "Can you ride in this?" he yelled over the thunder. She nodded, terror and adrenaline flooding her system. "Then ride! We can't lose the herd!" They charged into the storm. Together, a mixed company of Americans and Germans, cowboys and prisoners, united by the urgent need to save frightened animals. The rain was so heavy Kata could barely see. Lightning illuminated the world in frozen tableaus, cattle running in every direction, Anna riding hard to turn a group away from a ravine, Tom's horse rearing as thunder cracked directly overhead. Kata found herself alongside Frank, the two of them working wordlessly to funnel cattle back toward the main group. Her horse knew the work better than she did, responding to the chaos with seasoned calm. For 2 hours they worked in the storm, soaked to the skin, mud-spattered, exhausted. Slowly, impossibly, they gathered the scattered herd and drove them toward the safety of a box canyon where they could shelter from the worst of the weather. When the last steer was accounted for, Frank counted heads. Everyone was there, exhausted but safe. He let out a whoop of relief that the others echoed. They'd done it. Riding back to the ranch, Kata found herself next to Frank. He looked over at her and shouted over the dying storm, "Couldn't have done it without you. You ride like you were born to it." She felt tears mixing with rain on her face. Born to it. She, a German prisoner, being praised for saving an American rancher's livelihood. The absurdity and beauty of it overwhelmed her. This man trusted her with his cattle, his livelihood, his life in a way her own government never had. The Reich had seen her as a cog in a machine. Frank Callahan saw her as a person capable of courage and skill. That night, as they dried off by the fire, and Martha served hot soup to everyone, prisoners and ranch hands sitting together in wet clothes and shared exhaustion, Kata understood with sudden clarity that everything she'd been taught was a lie. Not just wrong, but deliberately constructed to serve power rather than truth. The enemy she'd been told to fear had shown her more humanity in 6 months than the Reich had shown in 6 years. The question that had been building in her mind finally crystallized. If America treated its prisoners this well, what did that say about the side she'd fought for? She wasn't alone in that realization. The moments of grace accumulated, each one a small crack in the foundation of ideology. There was Christmas of 1944, when Martha had insisted on celebrating with everyone. She'd baked a ham and made sweet potatoes, and somehow procured a small Christmas tree that they decorated with popcorn strings and paper ornaments. The German women had been reluctant at first, the holiday reminding them too sharply of homes they might never see again, families that might not have survived. But Martha was determined to create joy. She taught them American carols, and they taught her German ones. When they sang Stille Nacht, tears flowed freely on both sides, the same song, Silent Night, in 2 languages, carrying the same message of peace. Frank proposed a toast with apple cider, the only alcohol available being carefully controlled. "To better days ahead," he said simply, "and to the folks around this table who've shown that decent people are decent people, no matter where they're from." They clinked their cups together, and Greta whispered to Caddy, "I never thought I'd spend Christmas with Americans and feel at home." Kata squeezed her hand. "I never thought Americans would feel like family." There was Anna's birthday in February, which she'd mentioned to no one, but Martha had somehow found out. The older woman appeared with a cake, slightly lopsided but lovingly frosted, with candles stuck in the top. "Can't let a birthday pass without celebrating," Martha declared. "Even in times like these, maybe especially in times like these." Anna cried, overwhelmed by the kindness of a woman whose country was at war with her own, yet who took the time to bake a cake for an enemy prisoner who'd become, somehow, a friend. The small dignities mattered most, being called by name instead of number, being asked rather than ordered, being trusted with tools and animals and responsibility. Sergeant Miller returning Katha's letters uncensored when he noticed they contained only family news and descriptions of ranch work. "I read German," he admitted. "Learned it in the last war. Nothing in here that threatens security, just a girl missing her mama. I'll let it go through." Tom teaching them American slang and laughing with them, not at them, when they got it hilariously wrong. The time Greta asked someone to bite the bullet when she meant bite the dust, and the resulting confusion had everyone in stitches. Or when Anna tried to say something was a piece of cake, but instead said, "a piece of cake," which Tom immediately declared should be a real saying about Christmas desserts. But alongside the joy and friendship lived a growing guilt that many women couldn't escape. The radio brought news of Germany's collapse, Berlin being encircled, cities reduced to rubble, refugees fleeing westward in millions. The women listened and felt their hearts split in two. Their countrymen were suffering unimaginable horrors while they sat safe in Texas, well-fed and treated with kindness. The injustice of it was almost unbearable. Kata lay awake many nights wrestling with the contradiction. Her mother was somewhere in the ruins of Hamburg, if she still lived. Her friends from before the war were dead, displaced, or suffering in ways she could barely imagine. Yet here she was, learning to rope cattle and eating apple pie. The guilt pressed on her chest like a physical weight. She'd survived by becoming the enemy's prisoner, by being fed by the people she'd been taught to hate. What did that make her? A traitor? A survivor? Both? Greta struggled with similar demons. One evening, after particularly bad news from the Eastern Front, she broke down completely. "My brother died at Stalingrad," she sobbed. "He died believing he was fighting for Germany's future. And for what? So Germany could be destroyed? So we could learn that everything we believed was a lie?" Martha held her while she cried, rocking her like a child, offering no words because there were no words adequate to such grief. The inner conflict intensified as victory in Europe drew closer. The women could see the end coming, read it in every newspaper headline and radio broadcast. Germany was finished. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years would last barely 12, and they, the prisoners, would have to return to the ashes and somehow build lives from the rubble. The prospect filled them with dread rather than hope. "I don't want to go back," Anna admitted one night, her voice barely a whisper. The other women looked at her, shocked to hear someone voice what they'd all been thinking. "There's nothing there. My city is gone. My family is probably dead. Here I have work. I have friends. I have a purpose. What will I have in Germany? Stones and starvation." "We have to go back," Kata said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Germany needs to be rebuilt. Our people need help." Even as she said it, she wondered if she believed it. Would the people who'd sent them to war want help from women who'd learned to love their captors? Would they be seen as traitors for speaking kindly of Americans? The question that haunted them most was the simplest and most profound. If the enemy had been this good to them, what did that say about the side they'd fought for? The Reich had promised strength through cruelty, victory through domination, greatness through conquest. America had demonstrated strength through abundance, victory through industrial might, and a kind of greatness that came from being so secure in their own power that they could afford to be kind to their enemies. Tom said it best, without meaning to, one afternoon while they were mending fence. "My grandpa always said you can tell a lot about folks by how they treat people who can't do nothing for them. Someone who's kind when they don't have to be. That's real character." He hammered a post into place, oblivious to the impact of his words. But Kata heard them and understood. America didn't have to treat them well. They were prisoners. The Geneva Conventions set minimum standards, and the U.S. had exceeded them at every turn. Not because they had to, but because they chose to, because it reflected who they wanted to be. That choice, that consistent daily choice to extend dignity rather than degradation, had accomplished something no weapon could achieve. It had won hearts and minds not through coercion, but through demonstration. The German women who'd arrived in Texas, convinced they'd met monsters, had instead met human beings who'd shown them what their own country could have been if it had chosen a different path. The propaganda had collapsed not through argument but through lived experience. And now, as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, they faced the hardest question of all. How do you go home when home has become the place you're leaving? The question of home became unbearable on the 8th of May, 1945, when the radio crackled to life with news that stopped the entire ranch mid-motion. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Frank stood by the radio in the kitchen, his hand frozen on the dial, listening to the announcement repeat itself. Martha came to stand beside him, and together they walked out to where the German women were hanging laundry on the line. The wind was blowing, making the sheets snap like flags, and for a moment no one spoke. "It's over," Frank said finally. "Germany has surrendered. The war is done." He'd thought the words would bring joy, or at least relief. Instead, Anna dropped the wet shirt she'd been holding and sat down hard on the ground, her face blank with shock. Greta covered her mouth with both hands. Kata simply stared at the horizon, that endless Texas sky that had become more familiar to her than the cramped streets of Hamburg. Over. The word should have meant liberation, but instead it felt like a door closing. That night, no one slept. The women gathered in the bunkhouse, sitting on bunks in the floor, speaking in low voices about what came next. "We'll be sent home," Greta said, her voice hollow. "Back to Germany." The words hung in the air like smoke. Home. But what was home now? The letters that had trickled through in recent months painted a picture of devastation so complete it seemed apocalyptic. Hamburg was rubble. Berlin was a graveyard. Dresden had been burned to ash. Millions of refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the advancing Russians, starving and desperate. "My sister's last letter was 4 months ago," Anna whispered. "She said they were eating wallpaper paste mixed with sawdust. That was before the final bombings. I don't even know if she's alive." Her voice cracked. "What am I going home to? What's left?" Kata thought of her mother, of the apartment in Hamburg that was probably now just a crater. She thought of the neighborhood where she'd grown up, the bakery on the corner where Herr Mueller had made the best pretzels, the park where she'd learned to ride a bicycle. All of it was gone, transformed into rubble and memory. And here in Texas, she had a bunk that was hers, a horse named Daisy who nickered when she approached, work that tired her body but satisfied something in her soul, and people who called her by name and smiled when she entered a room. "I don't want to go back," she said, and the admission felt like blasphemy. "God forgive me, but I don't want to leave here." The other women looked at her, and in their eyes she saw the same terrible truth reflected. They were prisoners who'd fallen in love with their captivity, enemies who'd found more humanity among those they'd been taught to hate than among those who'd sent them to war. The guilt of it was crushing, but the truth of it was undeniable. The official notification came 2 weeks later. The U.S. Army was beginning repatriation procedures. All prisoners of war would be processed through main camps, then transported to ports for return to Europe. The timeline was fluid, depending on available shipping, but they should prepare to depart within 60 days. 60 days. 2 months to say goodbye to a life that had, impossibly, become more real than the one they'd left behind. The work continued, but everything was colored now by the knowledge of ending. Each fence they mended, each cow they tended, each sunset they watched had the quality of a last time. Frank and Martha tried to maintain normalcy, but the sadness hung over the ranch like humidity before a storm. Tom stopped joking as much. Sergeant Miller, on his weekly visits to check on the work detail, seemed to find excuses to linger, as if postponing the inevitable. Martha began baking obsessively, filling the kitchen with pies and cookies and breads, as if she could somehow fortify them against the hunger they'd face back home. "Take these," she'd say, wrapping things in wax paper and cloth. "I know it won't last the journey, but maybe for a little while." Greta helped her, and together they cried over pie dough and biscuit batter, mourning a friendship that war had made possible and peace would end. The packing was brutal in its simplicity. They'd arrived with nothing and would leave with little more: a change of clothes, letters from home, carefully preserved, small gifts the ranch families had given them over the months. Kata folded the denim work pants and cotton shirts she'd worn for nearly a year, her fingers lingering on the fabric. These clothes had seen her transformation from a terrified prisoner to a woman who could ride a horse and mend a fence and hold her head high. In Germany, she'd have to wear whatever could be scrounged from the ruins. The thought made her want to weep. 3 days before they were scheduled to leave, Frank gathered everyone in the yard. His face was weathered and serious, and he held his hat in his hands like he was at a funeral. "Don't rightly know how to say this," he began, his voice rougher than usual. "So I'll just say it plain. You ladies have been the best workers I could have asked for. More than that, you've become part of this ranch, part of this family. I know you got to go home, and I know home's going to be hard for a good while. But I want you to know," his voice broke, and he had to stop and clear his throat. "I want you to know you'll always have a place here if you ever need it. That ain't just talk. That's a promise." Martha stepped forward with a box. Inside were gifts, small things that meant everything. A Stetson hat for Cathy, cream-colored and soft, just like the one Frank wore. A jar of preserves for Anna, made from the ranch's own peaches. For Greta, a quilt they'd finished together, each square a memory stitched in. Fabric. There were hand-carved wooden crosses from one of the ranch hands who worked with wood in his spare time. A harmonica for one woman who'd learned to play from Tom. Letters of reference, carefully worded, stating that the bearer had worked honestly and well, signed by Frank Callahan and dated May 1945. "These might help," Frank said. "If you ever need to prove you're decent folk, show these. And if you ever want to come back to America, to Texas, you write to us. We'll do whatever we can to help." Tom stood off to the side, his hat pulled low, but Kata could see his shoulders shaking. This young man who'd taught her to rope, who'd joked with her in his slow drawl, who'd shared cigarettes and stories around the fire, was crying for women who'd been his enemy a year ago. The power of that, the beautiful impossibility of it, broke something open in Catha's chest. The morning of departure arrived too quickly and not quickly enough. The truck came at dawn, U.S. Army green, its engine idling in the yard while the women carried their sparse belongings outside. The driver was polite but businesslike, checking names against a roster, organizing the loading with military efficiency. This was routine for him, just another transport. For the women loading into the back, it was the end of a world. Frank and Martha stood by the gate, Tom and the other ranch hands lined up beside them. They'd all come to say goodbye, even though it was a workday and there were 100 tasks waiting. As each woman climbed into the truck, they paused to shake hands, to hug, to try to find words for something that transcended language. Greta embraced Martha and they stood locked together for a long moment, two mothers who'd lost children to war, who'd found in each other a kind of solace. Anna shook Tom's hand, then impulsively kissed his cheek, making him blush red as Texas clay. "Thank you," she said in careful English, "for making prisoner feel like person." Tom's voice was thick when he replied, "You take care of yourself, Annie. You ever get back this way, you better come visit, you hear?" Catha was last. She stood before Frank and Martha, this couple who'd shown her more parental kindness in 1 year than she'd known in her entire life under the Reich. "I don't have words," she said, and it was true. How do you thank someone for saving your soul, for showing you that the world could be different than you'd been taught, for treating you with dignity when they had every reason not to? Frank settled the Stetson on her head, adjusting the brim carefully. "You wear that proud," he said. "You earned it, and Catha." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Germany's lucky to have you coming home. You're going to help rebuild that country, right? I just know it." He pulled her into a hug, this formal German woman and this Texas cowboy, two people who should have been enemies embracing like father and daughter. Martha pressed something into her hand, a small notebook, its pages filled with recipes written in Martha's careful script. "So you can remember," she whispered, "so you can make biscuits and think of us." Catha clutched it like a lifeline and climbed into the truck. The engine revved. The truck began to move, pulling away from the ranch house, from the barn, from the corral where Daisy stood watching with liquid brown eyes. The women crowded at the back, hands gripping the wooden slats, watching the only home that had ever treated them with real kindness receding into distance. And the tears came. Not quietly, not with dignity, but in great wrenching sobs that shook their bodies. Cowboys stood in the yard, hats held over their hearts, as if at a funeral, because it was a kind of death, this parting. Martha waved until the truck disappeared around a bend, then buried her face in Frank's shoulder. The women in the truck held each other and cried, mourning a captivity that had been kinder than freedom, a prison that had felt more like home than home itself ever had. Catha looked back one last time at the endless Texas sky, that impossible blue that went on forever. She adjusted the Stetson on her head and whispered the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I am leaving my prison, but I have never felt more free." The contradiction of it, the painful, beautiful truth of it, was almost too much to bear. She'd been more herself, more valued, more human as a prisoner in Texas than she'd ever been as a free citizen of the Reich. What did that say about freedom? What did that say about the world they'd believed in? The journey back was the inverse of their arrival, but where that first journey had been filled with fear, this one was heavy with grief. They were processed through the main camp, given medical examinations, issued new clothes for the journey. Other prisoners joined them, men and women from camps across Texas, all wearing the same expression of reluctant departure. They'd arrived as enemies. They were leaving as witnesses. The trains took them east, back across the continent they'd crossed in fear. But now they watched America pass with different eyes, seeing not a foreign enemy, but a land that had shown them mercy. The factories still running, the fields still green, the plenty that seemed impossible after years of scarcity. Some women wrote letters even before boarding the ships, desperate to maintain the connections they'd formed. "Dear Martha and Frank," Catha wrote, her handwriting shaking with the motion of the train. "I'm on my way back to Germany, but my heart remains in Texas. You showed me what kindness looks like, what strength really means. I will carry those lessons home and try to live worthy of them. Thank you will never be enough, but thank you." The ships that carried them back across the Atlantic were crowded with prisoners and displaced persons, all heading toward an uncertain future. The women from Texas stayed together, bound by shared experience. They talked late into the night about what they'd seen, what they'd learned, making sense of transformation that felt both profound and impossible to explain. How could they tell other Germans about cowboys who'd treated them like family? About abundance so complete that even prisoners lived better than free citizens back home? About a nation so confident in its own strength that it could afford to be kind to its enemies? The answer was, they couldn't. Not at first. When they arrived in Germany in late summer of 1945, they stepped into a nightmare. The photos and letters hadn't captured the full horror. Cities were moonscapes of rubble. Survivors moved like ghosts through the ruins, hollow-eyed and starving. Children begged for scraps. The smell of death and decay hung over everything. Kata stood in what had been Hamburg and couldn't find a single landmark she recognized. It was all gone. The apartment building where she'd grown up was a pile of bricks. The street itself was barely identifiable under debris. But she was alive. She was strong. And she carried with her lessons learned under an endless Texas sky. How to work hard without being broken. How to lead through respect rather than fear. How to rebuild not just structures, but dignity. The other women scattered across the ruins of Germany carried similar lessons. They became nurses, teachers, administrators in the Reconstruction. They spoke quietly when asked about their time in America, about captivity that had been more humane than freedom. Their stories spread person to person, a counter-narrative to the propaganda that had poisoned a generation. In the years that followed, letters crossed the Atlantic. Kata wrote to Frank and Martha every few months, describing the slow rebuilding of Germany, the progress and setbacks. They wrote back with news of the ranch, of cattle drives and new calves, always ending with, "Come visit when you can." In 1953, 8 years after leaving Texas, Kata did. She'd saved enough for passage, and she'd obtained permission to immigrate. She returned not as a prisoner, but as a free woman, choosing to build a life in the place that had shown her who she could become. She wasn't alone. Anna came back in 1956, Greta in 1958. Of the 23 women who'd worked at the Callahan Ranch during the war, 8 eventually returned to America, settling in Texas and becoming citizens. They married, raised families, built businesses. They became living bridges between two nations, witnesses to the truth that humanity could survive even in war, that kindness could be more powerful than weapons, that treating enemies with dignity could transform hatred into friendship. Kata lived until 1992, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall, long enough to see Germany reunified and rebuilt into a democratic nation. In her small house in San Antonio, she kept the Stetson Frank had given her hanging on the wall and Martha's recipe book in her kitchen. She made biscuits for her grandchildren and told them stories about cowboys and cattle, about a time when being a prisoner meant being saved, about the tears she'd cried not at arriving but at leaving. The greatest weapon America had, she told them, wasn't the atomic bomb or the factories or the soldiers. It was the simple fact that they could be kind when they didn't have to be, that they could see enemies as people, that they could win a war without losing their humanity. That's what defeated the Reich more completely than any battle. We came home and we told the truth, that everything we'd been taught was a lie, that the enemy had more honor than our own leaders. That truth spread like wildfire. That's how you really win a war, by making your enemies want to be like you. The tears at goodbye had been real as the fear at arrival. But between those two moments lay a transformation that shaped the rest of the 20th century. German women who'd been prisoners of war became ambassadors of a different kind of strength, witnesses to the power of decency, proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, there were people who chose kindness over cruelty, dignity over degradation, hope over hate. They'd arrived in Texas as prisoners. They'd left as living testimony to the truth that would help rebuild the world, that our enemies are human too, and treating them as such is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. The tears at goodbye were not just for a place or for people, but for a brief shining moment when the world had shown them what it could be, if only we chose to make it so.